Ramos Chandler, and I'm your host today for Diving into the Discourse. Joining me today is evolutionary biologist Jeremy Yoder, one of our stars and rising stars here at California State University, Northridge, whose specialty are Joshua trees, those beautiful, magnificent Dr. Seuss-like plants that dominate the southwestern Mojave Desert. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Yoder.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Let's discuss why Joshua trees are so important and the role they play in our environment.
Yeah, so Joshua trees are, we often say, a keystone species in the Mojave Desert. They're the largest plant in a lot of Mojave Desert landscapes. So they're providing food and shelter for all sorts of animals, nesting for birds and small mammals, and even some reptiles. I think they're also a part of a really unique landscape. The Mojave has some of the largest tracts of undeveloped land that we still have in the lower 48 states. And Joshua trees are part of a lot of those landscapes.
Now, I know that there has been some pushback in Southern California in the West to efforts to conserve Joshua trees. Why is it so important that we do all we can to save the species?
Well, because of their ecological role, because of their cultural role. But I think, the Joshua trees are in an interesting position right now because they are associated with this untouched wilderness, and we want to conserve populations in those situations. They're also growing in the backyards of people who live in some of the fastest growing communities in Southern California. The Antelope Valley cities have grown dramatically since the 80s. They are facing habitat changes due to climate change that really do threaten the survival of the species over the long term. But one of the key things we need to do to reduce that threat is build out renewable energy. And some of the best places for renewable energy development are places where Joshua trees grow.
So it's that balance of trying to save them, but in the process of saving them, you're taking some of their land away.
That's right. So we are facing situations where it makes sense in some cases to displace Joshua trees in order to save the larger species.
What important first are your studies about? And the latest one, which track the history of climate change impact, not just like 10 years, more than 100 years of history, which we did not know. Why is all this knowledge important?
Well, so most immediately, one of the ways we solve that dilemma between the need to build out solar and wind energy development in the Mojave Desert and the need to protect the Joshua trees is by prioritizing. Joshua trees have the advantage. They still occupy probably a pretty large percentage of the habitat that they did even before European settlers arrived in Southern California. So we've got space to figure out what we can do. And we can do that by, among other things, trying to identify what Joshua tree populations are in places where they're doing well, they're likely to continue to have suitable conditions even as climate changes. Maybe they have genetic variation that will help them to adapt. That finding those populations and making sure they're protected lets us also step back and say, well, this is another, over here, there are trees that are in a place where it's going to be way too hot and dry for them in another 50 years. The population is already failing. We probably don't want to spend the effort to protect those. If we have to put a solar panel somewhere, we should put it there. But making those decisions takes a lot of basic data collection, and so we don't have really good data on the long-term health of Joshua tree populations. We don't have a good sense of what genetic variation might be important for protecting or for responding to climate change. And we don't even have a really fine scale sense of where in the desert are the populations that are likely to remain in suitable conditions even as climate changes.
I think other evolutionary and environmental biologists would be jealous of the opportunity the time you still have to collect this data with this species, because there are other species in the world where we didn't think about this until it's too late.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So you compare the Joshua Tree situation to giant sequoias, for example. They were already in sort of a very restricted distribution relative to where they used to grow, say, back during the last ice age. And then Europeans came along and said, oh, these make great timber. So we spent a long time cutting them down before we decided to protect the last remnants we have. And now we're in a situation where a single fire can destroy a large fraction of that population. But Joshua trees have a much more resilient population base than that at this point.
What attracted you to this particular field of study?
So I originally started working on Joshua trees because I am interested in species interactions. And Joshua trees have a very unusual, very specialized mutualistic interaction with pollinating moths. Yucca moths are unique among pollinators in that they're very deliberate about what they do. So a honeybee visiting a flower it's not there to benefit the flower. It is there to collect nectar or maybe pollen, because bees often also eat pollen, but it's accidental. It's not something the bee is trying to do. Yucca moths, on the other hand, they deliver pollen very deliberately. They are guided missiles for pollen delivery. A female yucca moth, after she has mated and is ready to lay her eggs, what she does is she goes to a flower and she gathers up pollen in specialized mouth parts that almost look like tentacles. We call them tentacles, and builds up this ball of pollen that she carries under her little chin. And she goes to another flower then and lays her eggs in the flower, and then climbs to the tip of the pistil, the female part of the flower, and it varies from species to species, but in the Joshua tree yucca moth, she actually takes her little forelegs and claws the pollen down from this ball under her chin and packs it into the tip of the pistil to fertilize the flower. It's very deliberate. And she's doing that because she's laid her eggs in the flower that she just fertilized. And so the flower is going to develop into a fruit, and there will be seeds developing inside that fruit as well because it's been pollinated. And the food source for her larvae that hatch out of those eggs inside the flower is Joshua tree seeds. So they don't eat all of the seeds. They eat, 10 to 20% of the seed crop, and that's the reward she gets for this effort. They don't feed as adults, so their life cycle is they stock up on Joshua tree seeds as caterpillars, and then when they're ready to move on to the adult phase, they don't do it immediately. They climb out of the fruit, they burrow into the soil. They make their cocoon, and then they put it all on pause. They go into what we call diapause and wait until the next time Joshua trees flower in the neighborhood. And they can potentially wait there for years. And then when flowering does happen, they finish development as adults. They come out of the cocoon and they find mates, and they pollinate Joshua trees and lay eggs.
The Joshua trees, the moths, are dependent on those trees for procreation, mm-hmm. and for their lives as larvae and caterpillars. Mm-hmm. Not as adults. But those Joshua trees rely on those moths to continue their propagation.
That's absolutely right. So the moths are such effective pollinators that the trees do not bother to try to attract anything else. They don't make any meaningful amount of nectar. They actually make very little pollen as these things go. So typically plants make much more pollen than they do ovules, the organs that will develop into seeds. Joshua trees make much less pollen per ovule than your typical flowering plant, because it is so efficiently delivered. They don't have to worry about the pollinators losing their way or eating the pollen or doing anything that would be inefficient. And the flowers are structured in such a way that they can't self-pollinate. So Joshua trees, if you see fruit on a Joshua tree, it's because yucca moths have been there.
So our concern should also be with the yucca moths.
Yes, indeed.
Are they also threatened by the shifts in the climate?
We don't know. The moths are considerably harder to observe than the trees. The trees, you can go out. They're there year round. They're the biggest thing on the landscape. The moths, in principle, I guess you could dig in the soil around the base of a Joshua tree and you might find some yucca moth caterpillars. But it would be pretty challenging, and you'd have to do a lot of digging.
And you'd disturb them or kill them, and
yes, it would not be good for the moths. So the way we almost everything we know about the moths is because we watch Joshua tree flowers for when they're active as adults, or because we collect fruit and bring it to the lab and then catch the larvae as they come out of the fruit looking for soil. So we have this very limited window into the moths. There's a student in the lab right now who is working on a project that is trying to identify some of what the moths, what climate conditions might be associated with the moths emerging from the soil to do their job, and whether that is different from the conditions that the trees respond to when they flower.
When we think about climate impact, we tend to be very selfish. Even though we created the problem, we think about how it's too hot for us, it's too wet for us, all of those things. When you're thinking about climate change in a desert environment, the idea of it being too hot doesn't register.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation in this particular habitat type. But basically it's the same deal as in in a much cooler condition. Joshua trees and other desert plants are very well adapted to cope with hot, dry conditions, but it's getting hotter. It's not necessarily getting drier, but rainfall is getting less reliable. We're seeing bigger swings from year to year. So we had, over the last couple years in Southern California, we went from a historical drought condition to multiple years with more than double our average rainfall in LA. And that also benefited the desert. Some of that made it over the mountains. And there have been a couple of quite wet years in the Mojave.
How does that the rainfall impact the cycle of a Joshua tree, its life cycle? It's bearing fruit, bearing flowers. What role does that water play, or the lack of water play?
What we think is that the trees respond to the signal of sort of the rainfall they receive over a couple of years. And this is typical for long-lived plants where they don't maybe go to the effort of reproduction every year because they have a century, 2 centuries to make fruit and seed and ensure the next generation. So they can afford to wait for really good conditions. And what we have seen in data from Joshua trees, so actually using records from the iNaturalist app, where we can see if Joshua trees have flowered or made fruit in a given year in a given place, and link that back to the weather and see what the weather-flowering relationship is. The trees are more likely to flower if they get more rain this year than they did last year. Basically, if they feel like they have gotten some extra resources, they take advantage of that and they flower.
And the flower leads to fruit, which leads to seeds, which leads to baby trees.
We hope so. Although the tree that is actually maybe the bigger issue for climate change is full-grown Joshua trees are pretty robust.
Yeah.
We think the trunk actually stores water. They have an extensive, if not very deep, root system, so they can hang on in pretty tough desert conditions. But Joshua tree seedlings are delicate little things. Their first few leaves are more like grass than the sort of stiff, sharp, succulent leaves we get on the adults. And so probably the vast majority of Joshua tree seeds first get eaten by things, and then the ones that survive that, when they germinate, when they first sprout, they're very delicate, and if they don't have good water and some shelter from heat stress, they probably don't make it very long at that stage. The ones that do the best, we think, are the ones that, through luck, basically end up in the shade of a larger shrub like a blackbush or some of the other low shrubs that co-occur with Joshua trees. And those, we call them nurse plants, provide a little bit of shade, a little bit of cooler, moister microclimate probably, and even more importantly, they provide some camouflage from all of the desert animals that would love to eat a tender little green shoot as it's just coming up.
That is so cool, because when you go to the desert, you don't think of that symbiotic relationship. And if you're thinking of those relationships, you're thinking of the rodent or the bird taking the seeds or chewing on the plant because they're hungry and that's where they're getting their food or their water. You don't think of shrubs being nursemaids.
Yeah, so there's an interesting strain of thought in evolutionary biology that goes back to a Russian thinker, actually, Kropotkin, who read Charles Darwin's theories of natural selection and thought they were really cool, but he lived in Russia and had a lot of experience with sort of stressful, cold situations and how organisms interacted in those situations. And so he advanced a theory that he called mutual aid, where there was the result of natural selection was not just everybody competing against each other. It was also finding these opportunities for sort of alliances in stressful conditions. And I think the desert operates that way in many respects as well. You get plants facilitating each other because they improve the local conditions just by being there. You get the Joshua tree and the yucca moth ending up very, very dependent on each other because they are good at their jobs and they need something reliable in conditions where they may go years without getting good rainfall.
There is an exhibit right now, hopefully it'll still be when this airs, up in Antelope Valley on the Joshua tree. I know you contributed to the book, the Kellogg. Why were you willing to participate in an exhibit like this as opposed to just sticking to publishing papers?
Oh yeah, so this was an interesting change of pace for me for sure.
Yeah.
But the curator of this exhibition, Sant Khalsa, reached out to me pretty early on in the process. She'd had the idea to put together an exhibition at the Lancaster Museum of Art and History, just about works about Joshua trees because they are so they have such cultural significance in Southern California. And so her original vision for it was to sort of put scientists and artists in a room together and try to get some new artworks from that. And we had some really interesting meetings with artists who were thinking about contributing to the exhibition, although nothing very concrete came together. Although one of the works in that exhibition does feature a data visualization that I did.
Wow.
And so we had the interaction with the artists. She also decided to put together a book presenting a lot of the work, and actually some works that they weren't able to get for the exhibition. There's a David Hockney, classic David Hockney painting of the Pear Blossom Highway, which has Joshua trees featured very prominently because they grow all along that highway.
Yeah.
And so that's in there, and it has a bunch of essays about the cultural history, the sort of larger significance of Joshua tree, and the natural history of the species, and how it's coping with climate change, what we know about that. And so I've contributed to some of those works.
How do you involve your students into and we're a CSU, we're not an R1, we're not a research institution, so the students working with you are not all on the road to getting their PhDs at that point. Why is it important for you to involve your students in this research?
Well, I think one of the sort of fundamental understandings that I have as a science educator, as a teacher, is that the best way to learn how to do science is to do it. This is why so many science classes have labs, right? We're trying to give students some of the experience of setting up an experiment and finding an answer to things. And often there's a trade-off there between giving the genuine experience, which is that sometimes the experiment doesn't pan out, versus giving a consistent result that is straightforward for the lab activity. But so research experiences sort of out of the classroom in the working lab, those are more of an opportunity to have that full experience from the start of a project to asking a question to assembling the data to figuring out whether you have an answer or not. And so, there's lots of levels at which students can engage at that. I have had students who come along for one field trip over spring break. I've had students who have been with the lab most of the time they've been here as undergrads. But I hope all of those are at least some experience of what the process is like.
You do a lot of out-of-the-box type of research. I mean, the partnering with iNaturalist and collecting data from databases of newspapers for the latest. That is not what I think a student thinks about, or the stereotype is of lab research.
Yeah, and that's actually something that that sometimes is a bit of a struggle for interesting students, because so many biology students are coming in thinking of biomedical or even med school as the next step. And certainly we do have lab activities where we're sequencing DNA, we're moving little volumes of liquid around in test tubes. But yeah, a lot of what I do is either going out to the desert and taking observations, or working with the vast amount of public data that we have on where species are found and what the situation is with them.
Now, your research isn't just Joshua trees.
That's right.
What other species are you looking at, or other concepts are you looking at?
So right now, one of the big projects in the lab is developing this the system that we use to understand the relationship between weather and flowering in Joshua trees. That gave us a new level of insight into how Joshua trees relate to climate variation that we had not had before. And I think the methods that we used for that are going to translate to a lot of other species. So the Toyin project is one step in that direction. The grad student project studying weather conditions that are important for yucca moths is an extension of that project. So there's that. I'm interested more generally in how species interactions shape evolutionary history, and so I've done work studying patterns of association between animal pollinators, much more diversity than just yucca moths, and flowers in terms of how floral structure shapes the diversity of things that visit the flowers, and how the genetic diversity of a plant species shapes the diversity of organisms that make a living in close association with those plants. So lots of insect herbivores spend most of their lives on and around their favorite food plant. And they experience strong natural selection arising from that interaction. And that, in fact, means that the genetic differences in the host plant are mirrored by genetic differences in the things that make a living off them.
I think what you're doing is fascinating, but it just hit me, and I hate it just at the political climate at the moment. I can see some curmudgeon-y person say, so why do I care about any of this?
Well, I would like to think you might care because plants are the foundation of life on Earth in a lot of ways. They are the link between the energy we get from the sun and the food that is available to everything else in terrestrial ecosystems. But also a lot of these processes that play out between a Joshua tree and a yucca moth or other plants and pollinators in the wild, these have direct implications for things like agriculture, right? What we understand of plants' interactions with insect herbivores, that goes directly into how we manage insect herbivores that are pests in agricultural systems, and pollination is very directly important for a lot of fruit and nut crops. Managing pollinator populations in almond groves is a big concern in California, for example. Almonds don't happen if there aren't animals visiting the flowers to pollinate.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Yoder, and thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with CSUN evolutionary biologist Jeremy Yoder, and tune in next time to dive into the discourse.